Your substack is called Everything is Bullshit. So maybe let's start from there. What is bullshit?
Well, I follow the philosopher Harry Frankfurt in defining bullshit as a reckless disregard for what is true. You could sort of think it as being analogous to the difference between murder and manslaughter, where murder is intentional and manslaughter arises out of reckless negligence. I think bullshitters will say whatever they need to say to get what they want, regardless of whether they know that it's true or know that it's false. They just don't really care one way or the other. Whereas a liar knows that what they're saying is false and they're saying it anyway.
Is there something in human nature that makes us more prone to lying or bullshitting or truth-seeking?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that bullshitting is more common than lying because it's less risky than lying. So if you get caught lying, no one could ever trust you again. But if you get caught bullshitting, I don't know, people might get annoyed. It's much easier to wiggle your way out of being accused of bullshitting. You could bullshit your way out of it, right? There's much more plausible deniability when it comes to bullshitting or when it comes to bending the truth or exaggerating or minimizing or omitting certain inconvenient details. So there's a reason why we engage in bullshitting more frequently than lying. It's a much less risky thing to do. It's often more advantageous for the bullshitter. There is this idea of Hanlon's razor where we should never attribute to malice that which can be attributed to stupidity. I think we can make a similar razor. We should never attribute to lying that which can be attributed to bullshitting. I think bullshitting is almost always going to be the correct answer rather than deliberate lying.
Why do we bullshit in the first place? If we can just map it out, is it because of social status? Is it because of personal gain? Or is it because of something else?
Yeah, both. Social status, personal gain. We bullshit because it benefits us, because it helps us present ourselves in the best possible light. You could think of the simplest example of bullshitting. You know, if you show up to a job interview, you're not going to talk about all the ways in which you suck and all the things that you failed to achieve. You're not going to talk about your worst qualities at the job interview. And so you could think of the job interview as a kind of bullshitting situation where your concern is not to present the most accurate possible picture of yourself. Rather, your goal is to present the best possible picture of yourself or the best picture that you can get away with. A maximum bullshitter in that situation, you know, might not even care whether what they're saying about themselves is accurate or not. They're just saying it to impress the interviewer. So yeah, I think we bullshit to make ourselves look good, to gain forgiveness, to gain sympathy, to gain attention. Whatever our social goals are, you name it, bullshitting can help us achieve those goals.
Do you think it is more, so if we have, let's say, bullshitting and truth-telling as two choices, do you see it as more of a binary choices or spectrum, and we are sometimes more in the bullshitting side or truth-telling side, and does it depend on situation or how do you see it?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, I guess it's probably a little blurrier than I'm making it out. It's more of a spectrum. I mean, you could be fully conscious that what you're saying is false. You could be partially conscious that what you're saying is false. You could be dimly aware of it. It could be unconscious, and yet you're doing it anyway. There could be a certain degree of self-deception. So yeah, it's a pretty blurry continuum. But nevertheless, I think each side of the continuum is a useful one to point to when we're talking about false or misleading information proliferating in a culture.
Yeah, I've met a lot of people, probably you've done this, you have as well, when they will say that, you know, I don't care about social status games. I am only interested in truth, and that's what guides my life. Yeah. What's happening inside their mind when they say that? Is it another form of bullshitting, or what's going on there?
Yeah. So I view that as a kind of anti-status play. You can think of anti-status as the status you get for appearing to not care about status. So overt status seekers, people who seem like all they care about is impressing people, looking good, making money, being better than you, whatever you want to call those people. I mean, we have a lot of colorful words for those people. We often refer to them in terms of the anus or in terms of the male reproductive organ, and we don't like them. So that suggests a kind of paradoxical nature to human status seeking. The only way we can successfully pursue and achieve status is if we cover up and disguise the status seeking motive, because if that motive were to become overt, we would look like an anus or a male reproductive organ. So insofar as everyone who's playing a status game becomes aware of the fact that we're all playing a status game, and we know that we all know that we all know that we're just a bunch of vainglorious peacockers, well, something weird happens. That you could say the status game collapses. It kind of inverts. We all used to be getting status for playing this game, and now we're losing status because we're seen as just a bunch of status seekers. And the status hierarchy kind of inverts a little bit. Like the people at the top, well, they were the most narcissistic and ego-driven, and the people at the bottom were the least narcissistic and ego-driven. So the hierarchy kind of inverts. Everyone sort of scrambles to stop playing that game, or signal that they're playing the opposite of that game, to signal that they actually don't care about status, which paradoxically raises their status. And so I view this collapsing of status games as a cool explanation for a lot of the cultural variation in status symbols and a lot of the seeming volatility and randomness that these status symbols can take on. So there's a status symbol. None of us really have common knowledge that it's a status symbol. And then when we gain common knowledge of it, we start to look uncool or vain or selfish for seeking it. And then we start to seek the opposite of that status symbol to show that we don't care about status, to gain status. And then the cycle repeats itself on and on. So I think that dynamic explains a lot of our status seeking. What your friend suggested he was doing is implausible to me as an evolutionary psychologist who knows the deep importance of social status to the human mind and to the human species. I am deeply skeptical of anyone who claims to not care about status. What I view that as is another kind of status move, another kind of status play, a play for anti-status.
Yeah, there is something, some aspect of this being not spoken widely enough that makes this status game exist. Yes, because if everyone else was honest about, hey, I'm doing this because I want to get this, and that's what I care about. If everyone said that, then the whole game would collapse.
That's right. Yeah. And so I think these sacred values of ours, like truth, equality, happiness, authenticity, self-actualization, whatever you want to call it, these are designed to stabilize a status game, to keep it from collapsing. We're not engaged in an intellectual pissing contest. We are in search of truth and knowledge and wisdom. We're not just competing to gain control of the coercive apparatus of the state so that we can dominate other people. We're pursuing equality and justice, or tradition, or patriotism, or whatever. These high-minded cover stories are designed to keep our status games from collapsing, to keep them stable into the future so that they make better investments of our time and energy. We don't want to invest in a status game that's going to collapse tomorrow or next year or the year after that. We want to invest in a status game that has remained stable down the generations, that is never going to collapse, where the players of the status game not only lack common knowledge that they're playing a status game, but they have common knowledge of the opposite, that they're doing something that is antithetical to status, that they're pursuing something noble and larger than themselves that has nothing to do with status or resources. That is the type of status game that inspires us, that activates our energy and our motivation. I think the emotion of inspiration itself, I think, is partly gauging the stability of the status game and whether it's worth our time and energy to invest in it. If we don't think it's going to collapse, and we think it's stable and it has lasted down the generations, and there's common knowledge that it has nothing to do with status and it has something to do with this beautiful, high-minded, sacred value, well, then I'm going to be inspired to participate in that status game. But if it's all in the open, it's all out in the open. If it's on the surface, if everyone is just blustering and there's just bravado and machismo and everyone's bragging, and it just seems like a pissing contest, then I'm going to feel the opposite of inspiration. I'm going to feel disillusioned. I'm going to want to get out of that status game and divest my time and energy.
Okay, what's the role of self-deception there? Because I may be actually 100% interested in getting some material gain, but I can also convince myself that I am actually doing it for some higher cause that goes beyond material. So what can we say about self-deception there?
Yeah, so I think it's very necessary to stabilize a status game because we need common knowledge that none of us are playing a status game, and we need common knowledge that we're pursuing something that is antithetical to status. So what common knowledge is just when everyone knows that everyone knows something. Steven Pinker has a wonderful book on common knowledge called When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. And it's really interesting because it matters not just that everyone knows it, but that everyone knows that everyone knows it. In the same way that when you say that the emperor has no clothes, everyone privately knows that the emperor is naked. But when the boy says it out loud, then it transitions from private knowledge to common knowledge. Everyone knows that the emperor is naked, and now everyone knows that everyone knows it. So in the context of a status game, self-deception is important because in order to create common knowledge of false information, you also need to have private knowledge of false information, right? If everyone knows that everyone knows something that is false, well, then me personally, I need to know that that thing is false, and I need to know that it's false. And so that is self-deception. And so we all benefit from deceiving ourselves in order to create common knowledge of this group-serving myth.
Yeah, I guess it would be some existential dread. Let's say you live for 40 years, 50 years chasing approval without even knowing it. And then one day you wake up, oh, look, I've spent my whole life chasing things just because I want the status. But now I've lived half of my life and I don't even see any value there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the right move is to demonize status seeking. I don't think we can avoid it. I don't think we can escape it. I think it's part of human nature. We can no longer avoid status seeking than we can avoid breathing or eating or defecating. These are basic desires that are built into our DNA. So I wouldn't get depressed necessarily by status seeking. I mean, that itself can be explained in this framework. What you're being depressed by is not the status seeking itself, but the overtness of it, the on the surfaceness of it. The fact that this thing is fragile and could collapse at any moment because it's so out in the open and on the surface, as opposed to being buried beneath a vast layer of a group mythology, right? So what is depressing is overt status seeking, not status seeking itself. And I think the best we can do as hierarchical primates is not to avoid status seeking, but to prioritize which kinds of status seeking are good for the world and are bad for the world, and to play the types of status games that are likely to benefit people and to avoid the types of status games that are likely to hurt people. And there's a great degree of variation in the effects that status games have on the world. Some of them have extraordinarily positive effects, like the status games surrounding the scientific method and scientific discovery. I ultimately think science is a status game, a competition for intellectual prestige, but it is a very good status game that has very positive effects on society in general. You could argue that the same is true of economic markets. If we're all competing to provide goods and services to one another at affordable prices, that tends to raise our collective standard of living. I would view that as another good status game. Effective altruism, where we're competing to help others in the most effective possible way, and the way that's most backed by rigorous evidence. I view that as a positive status game. But just because they're status games doesn't mean they're bad. We have to look at their effects on the world. And I think that's the correct way to think about status seeking, is not to view it as bad or to demonize it or be depressed by it, but to pick and choose what forms of it are the healthiest and the best for society.
Right. So from what I understand from it, what you're saying, because usually when we speak about status games, it sounds a bit more like immoral or something, but what you're saying is that it is actually wired into our biology, and it's up to you to choose what kind of status game are you playing. That then the question of ethics enter at that stage.
Yeah. So what is the question of ethics in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, let's say, what am I interested in my life? What I'm pursuing at the like, what do I wish to achieve? Let's say in 5 years, 10 years. Is there anything beyond satisfaction of my everyday needs or long-term needs status, or is there something bigger than myself that even if I don't get the benefit, I want to still pursue it? Yeah.
Yeah. I think the language that you're using, to me, hints at the sort of sacred values that I'm talking about. We want to participate in a stable status game that in which nobody is aware that it's a status game, and in fact, one in which everyone is fully convinced that they're doing something that is the opposite of status seeking, that is above and beyond petty egotistical concerns, something that is exalted, transcendent, high-minded. That is ultimately what we're searching for and what we're inspired by. And I think there's good evolutionary reasons why we are inspired by those types of status games, because they have the most potential for long-term stability into the future. And I think the long-termness of it matters a lot, because ideally we're hierarchical primates. Status is contagious by association. If we gain lots of status, that's going to be passed on to our children. So ideally we want to invest in something that's going to last our entire lives and beyond our deaths, that can be passed on to our children and grandchildren. So I think we really are looking for something that is meaningful in the long term and that is sacred in the long term. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it does come down to a status motive, and I think that is somewhat depressing. Ideally, it would just be completely pure and benevolent and altruistic. And I think once we start to gain a glimpse of the more unflattering foundations of it, it can be disorienting to some people. But at the same time, I think it's important to every now and then take an honest glimpse at it, if for no other reason than to understand how reality works, and to understand how human psychology works, and to understand that if we want to affect any change in the world, it's going to have to be made through the real desires and motivations of real humans. And those desires and motivations will inevitably include status. And it's going to be the most powerful lever that we can pull if we want to affect change in society.
Is there any test, framework, or criteria that we can use to distinguish more desirable status games from the undesirable status games?
Yeah, I mean, I would just, look at the effects it has on society, whether it tends to result in things that we all like and value, like resources, wealth, discovery, innovation, peace, safety, security, technology that enriches our lives, things that are uncontroversially good, that we can all agree that these are good things and we'd like to see more of them. And, things that are uncontroversially bad, like violence, death, destruction, disease, conflict, war. Insofar as a status game produces those outcomes, I think we can all agree that, that's a bad status game to be playing.
Yeah, the reason I asked this question, I saw this article also in your Substack. I didn't read it, but it was, why utilitarianism is bullshit. And you mentioned something interesting there. You said the effects on society. So maybe let me pivot there. So what do you mean by effects on society, and why utilitarianism, which is understood as the maximization of the goods by all members of society, is a bullshit in that scenario?
Yeah, so I want to be clear that I'm not, I don't think that utilitarian concerns are unimportant or that they don't matter. I do think that they clearly do. We would all agree that, all else equal, a world with more happy people is better than a world with more suffering people. Where I disagree with utilitarians is in the claim that it's the only thing that matters. That is all that we care about, or all we ought to care about. I think that claim strikes me as fallacious, nonsensical bullshit, for lack of a better word. And this isn't to disparage utilitarians. These people are very smart and thoughtful. I used to be a utilitarian myself. I sort of gradually evolved out of it as I became more familiar with evolutionary psychology and its implications for philosophy. For me, the first blow that was dealt to my utilitarian philosophy was just a deeper understanding of what happiness and suffering are, and sort of replacing a naive view of happiness and suffering as a kind of intrinsically feel good or feel bad mental substance, with a more rigorous view from cognitive science that views these things as specialized brain mechanisms that have specific functions that evolved to fulfill particular purposes that help us survive and reproduce. And once you view, say, suffering in those terms, it becomes far less clear that suffering is a bad thing. It's there for a reason. Natural selection brought it into existence for a reason. And that reason is it helps us. It helps us avoid and prevent and deal with bad things. If we didn't have suffering, we would be constantly running into bad things, and our lives would, and all the things we care about would be constantly slipping through our fingers. We'd be putting our hand on the hot stove over and over and over again without learning from our mistakes. So suffering is valuable. I think the idea that we want to eliminate it or eradicate it is absurd and nonsensical to me once you understand what it is in evolutionary terms. The same thing goes for happiness. I don't think we're pursuing happiness. I have written a lot about this. I have a post called Happiness is Bullshit, a follow-up called Happiness is Bullshit Revisited. I think we really ought to burn with fire this idea that we are little homunculi pursuing mental goodies inside of our heads. I think that is an incorrect view of the human psyche. I think once you understand that we are evolved creatures and that we evolved to pursue real things in the world that would have impacted our ancestors' survival and reproduction, things like safety, status, health, resources, power, whatever. Those are the things we're pursuing, and they're real, and they're in the world, and we care about them being real. We would not want to be deluded or deceived about those things. Those of our ancestors who were deluded or deceived about where the resources were, about whether they had status or not, about whether their mates were faithful to them, those people did not become our ancestors. The people who became our ancestors were the ones who were vigilant against being deceived and deluded, and who cared deeply that their motivations were tracking real things in the world. So I don't think we are seeking things in our head. I think we are seeking real things in the world. And what happiness is a way of correcting our predictions when we underestimate how good something is. So when we're surprised by the deliciousness of a meal or the beautifulness of a date, our brain has a lot of work to do. We guessed wrong. Our brain screwed up. And what the brain needs to do is correct all of our expectations, correct our motivations, and shift our priorities so that they're more accurately aligned to things of value in the world. And it needs to affect changes in our body. If we expected the date to be boring and it turns out that the person is beautiful, well, we did not have enough energy to deal with that situation, and our brain needs to give us a jolt of energy or excitement so that our body is better matched to the situation. The same thing goes if we're dreading the performance evaluation and it turns out to be fine. Well, our brains gave us too much energy and it will need to quickly relax us. And we'll feel a wave of relaxation or relief. So you can think of all of these mental and bodily changes, correcting predictions, correcting motivations, shifting bodily and physiological states. This is what we call happiness. This is what we call pleasure. Happiness is a verb. It's not a noun. It's a process that is happening in the mind and body when something is unexpectedly good. And that process will tend to decline over time the more we experience it. So when you get the new car, it's awesome at first, but the more you get used to it, the more the happiness from that new car fades, right? And that goes with anything that makes you happy. Happiness phase is called habituation. There's decades of research on this. It's really robust. And what this suggests to me is that our view of happiness is backwards. We're not so much pursuing happiness as chasing it away. The more we live our lives, the less frequent and intense our happy and joyous experiences become. There's a meta-analysis showing this, that happiness starts to decline at age 8 and continuously declines throughout the entire lifespan, all the way up to age 93, or at least the age of the people in the sample. So again, we're not pursuing happiness, we're chasing it away. I don't think we should view it as a mental substance of intrinsic goodness. I think we should view it as a process, as a verb, as a thing that helps us achieve our goals by correcting our expectations and our bad predictions. And once you view happiness in those terms, and once you view suffering in those terms, it really makes no sense to say that we want to maximize those things. Happiness is like a kind of software update when you guess wrong. And I don't think any of us want to spend our entire lives inside of a software update or maximize the number of software updates we get. What we want is real and in the world. We don't want a substance inside of our heads. And so to me, the entire infrastructure of utilitarianism is based on those intuitions, that there are these mental substances of intrinsic value. And I think that's just wrong. So that's, one of the main reasons why I'm skeptical of utilitarianism, why I think it's bullshit. The other big reason why I think it's bullshit is that it is unevolvable. It is inconsistent with what we know about the evolutionary biology of altruism. It is inconsistent with what we know about human nature. Utilitarian motivations, genuinely, deeply utilitarian motivations, where you want to benefit all sentient beings, that type of motivation cannot evolve by natural selection. It just can't. We've known, since the 1970s in evolutionary biology that organisms do not evolve to act for the good of the species. They evolve to act for the good of the genes that constructed them. Laid out beautifully in Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. This has been the centerpiece of modern evolutionary biology, gene-centered thinking, inclusive fitness thinking. Utilitarian motivations are incompatible with that framework. Any altruist that was motivated to benefit sentient beings at the expense of itself would be selected out of the gene pool. So I think these types of deeply, genuinely utilitarian motivations just cannot be a part of human nature. They're just not who we are. And so insofar as the utilitarian is claiming that they have these deeply utilitarian motivations, I think they're bullshitting. I think they are mistaken about their underlying psychology. And so that's another reason why I think utilitarianism is bullshit, and why I think we should abandon it due to its incompatibility with human nature.
Yeah, there are a lot of things there. Yeah, I guess this is very similar to what Nietzsche said about utilitarianism when he said the mankind does not seek happiness, only the Englishman does, referring to the English utilitarian philosophers there. I mean, if we had to update utilitarianism with the findings that we have from evolutionary psychology, what would be the optimal, more relevant theory there?
Yeah, I think we're sensitive to the costs and benefits that are inflicted on the people in our social group. And it makes sense that we would be sensitive to those costs and benefits. If I make a decision that results in the death of 10 people in my tribe, that is going to be very bad for me, right? And I really want to avoid making that decision. I'm toast if I make that decision. And if I'm deciding between, a decision that will result in the deaths of 10 people versus 20 people, I should be sensitive to that difference as well, right? The more costs that I inflict on other people, the worse that's going to be for me as a member of a highly intensely social species. So I think we do have utilitarian intuitions when it comes to our decision making and when it comes to our moral judgment. We are sensitive to the costs and benefits that are inflicted on others and the degree and numerical value of those costs and benefits. Where I disagree with utilitarianism is that encompasses our moral life, and that is all there is to living an ethical life. I think there's far more to it than that. There's far more richness and complexity in the types of social problems that our moral intuitions evolved to solve. And costs and benefits inflicted on others are just one type of problem that our moral intuitions evolved to solve, but there are many others. So I think an evolutionarily informed utilitarianism would not be utilitarianism. It would properly respect the complexity of our moral psychology. You could think of this as a kind of particularism, where what's right depends on the particulars of the situation and not on some overall maximizing principle or deontological principle. It just depends on the particulars. What is the context? Who are the people in the situation? What is the history of each person? What are their goals? What are the consequences? All of these details matter in terms of our moral judgments. And I don't think we can ignore them, and I don't think we can sweep the complexity of human moral psychology under the rug. I don't think we should try to.
So, yes, if we consider that the status-seeking game, getting the status approved, is part of our evolution, we have all these philosophical traditions. Yes, Stoics and Buddhists, for example, Stoics always emphasize that don't focus on the outcome. You do not necessarily have any control for the outcome. So, but what's happening there when they make these claims? And also, I mean, for the last 10, 15 years, we've seen huge increase in the interest in these philosophies, and what's happening there? Why so, and why now?
Stoicism. So this is, I confess, I'm not super familiar with the particulars of Stoicism. So the idea there is that you are focused on the process and not the outcome of your motivations, of properly and fully striving for something rather than being fixated on the results.
Yeah, it's. It depends on also the specific philosopher or school. Usually, the emphasis, as it's understood today in the commonly understood way, is that don't focus on the outcomes. Focus on the process itself. You may not have the full control over the outcomes. Don't get attached to them. You will be disappointed in any case. Live according to the nature. Yeah, that's the main idea. Living according to the nature, and nature understood as letting things unfold. There is there might be an order outside your control, and let things unfold and you become part of it, basically.
In that sense, I think I might be on board with Stoicism, or at least the idea that we shouldn't be pursuing happiness itself as the outcome. For one thing, I don't think we are pursuing happiness at a deep level. I think it's more accurate to say that we're chasing it away. For another thing, if we try to pursue happiness as a means to some other end, say that, I try to appear happy, to look like I'm high status and well adjusted and look good to my peers. You see a lot of that on Instagram, this kind of happiness status competition. If I'm trying to be happy to achieve some other social goal, I think that can be extremely bad and corrosive, because I am unable to achieve it. So if happiness is designed to adjust my expectations in the wake of a prediction error, then it is literally impossible to pursue happiness. Because if happiness arises when something unexpected happens, when something is unpredictable, well, I cannot predict unpredictability by definition, right? I cannot plan my own surprise party. And that's what it would take to actually pursue happiness, is to plan your own surprise party, right? And so we can't do it. So insofar as we're trying to be happy to fulfill some other social goal, we are setting ourselves up for continual disappointment. And so in that sense, I think the Stoics are right, that we shouldn't be trying to strive for this mental state of happiness. We should be focused more on the striving itself, and making sure that we're devoting the right amount of effort and energy and attention to a particular goal, and that we are well calibrated to seek things that really have value in the world, and that should be our focus, not the end result in the form of happiness. So yeah, in that sense, I think I can get on board with Stoicism.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about your earlier remarks about bullshit being the part of social norms. I mean, I always think of this in the form of, let's say, you work in a company or in some setting, and you talk with your coworker, and they ask you, "How are you?" I mean, it's
Yeah.
almost 99% expected you are supposed to tell, "I'm fine."
Yeah.
I mean, I saw a meme before. It says the person was asking, "How are you?" and the other person was saying, "I had a really bad day today. I had this fight with someone else, and now I'm feeling terrible and this and this." And the other person is looking and says, "Next time, just shut the fuck up and say I'm fine." Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
when I say I'm fine, it's like I'm acknowledging that, hey, I'm accepting the game. I'm not
Yeah.
rebelling against it. Don't expect anything radical from me, and I'm okay. Don't worry. I'm keeping my private life to myself.
Yeah. No, I like that. It's a beautiful example of the expectation set by our culture that we're supposed to be happy, and when we deviate from that expectation, that is a kind of social norm violation. Yeah, I think I'm okay, I'm fine is probably the most you can rebel against it and get away with it. If you actually say that you're feeling like shit, probably that's going to be a social norm violation. Probably keep it to yourself, unless you're with a really close and trusted person who genuinely wants to know if you're feeling like shit. In that case, it's good to tell that person. And I think it's important to try to cultivate those relationships, because I think that might even be a good way of distinguishing a close, good relationship from a more superficial relationship. Are they the type of person that you can say, "I'm feeling like shit," and they're not going to judge you for it or feel uncomfortable for it? They're going to be genuinely interested in why you're feeling that way, and compassionate, and doing what they can to help you out. So that, I think, is the sign of a good relationship. And I think, unfortunately, it seems like those types of relationships are dwindling a bit, and there's an increase in these kinds of superficial relationships, and that might feed into the kind of alienation that you talked about, and why people are grasping for things like Stoicism or Buddhism to try to counter these feelings of alienation. I think we are more awash in superficial relationships than we ever have been in our evolutionary history, and I think we hunger for something deeper, and something more authentic and real with the people in our lives.
Yeah, I guess if the common assumption in a society and relationships is that you're supposed to chase this happiness or feeling fine, this utilitarian idea, So if you say I'm not fine, that means something is wrong with you, and you, if something is wrong with you, and that makes me uncomfortable, because then this whole dynamics break down. So I think there is a link there with the utilitarianism aspect as well, that we are always supposed to chase this happiness, being finer than the yesterday, and so on and so on.
Yeah, no, I think of utilitarianism as the culmination of the worst parts of Western culture, our fixation, our obsession with happiness, that all we should care about is inside of our heads, as opposed to in the world. And I think utilitarianism takes that view and just takes it to its logical extreme. If all we care about is happiness, that's all we're pursuing in life, well, that's the only thing we should care about ethically too. And so it's not only about our personal lives, it's also about ethics. Let's just center the entirety of human existence around this mental state. That strikes me as extremely simplistic, absurd, and wrongheaded.
Yeah, maybe breaking down things from time to time is a pleasure in itself, even rebelling against something, and in that sense, yeah.
Even if it makes you unhappy. I think, rebelling against the conventional wisdom, even if it results in people, judging you in ostracism, or if it's a risk for you financially to say that the emperor is naked, even if that takes a toll on your happiness, I think in some cases it's okay to say that it's still good, right? Yourself is good, even if it makes you unhappy, or if it, makes other people unhappy.
Yeah. So, okay, let me ask you about this. So, yeah, what is charisma?
Yeah. So I have a deceivingly complicated definition of charisma, deceptively, I guess. And I define it in terms of social paradoxes. And rather than try to define what a social paradox is, I'll just list a few of them for you and see if you can identify the common pattern. So we already talked about one of them. We try to get status by not caring about status. There's something paradoxical about that. Let me name some other ones. So we bravely defy social norms so that people will praise us. We don't care what other people think, and we want them to think that. We rebel against conformity in the same way as everyone else. We show humility to prove that we're morally superior. We consume anti-consumerism. We avoid being manipulative to get people to do what we want them to do. We avoid being an attention seeker so that people will pay attention to us. We show everyone our true, authentic self, not who society wants us to be, because that is ultimately who society wants us to be. You get the idea. So what's the common thread to all of these social paradoxes? I think the common thread is a social signal that is concealed from both the signaler and the recipient. So to give a concrete example, let's take virtue signaling. The virtue signaler does not know that they are virtue signaling, or does not see themselves as a virtue signaler. They see themselves as standing up for what is right. At the same time, the audience of the virtue signaler does not see the virtue signaler as a virtue signaler. If they did, they would not award that person virtue. In fact, they would look down on that person. We tend to negatively judge virtue signalers. So if I'm to successfully virtue signal to you, for example, I cannot know that I'm virtue signaling, and you cannot know that I'm virtue signaling. The signal is unknown to both of us. And that is where the paradox arises. The act of concealing my virtue signaling is itself a signal, right? Other examples, the brave norm violator does not believe that he is seeking praise, and neither does the audience who praises him. The authentic person does not believe that she is behaving exactly how society wants her to behave, and neither do the members of society. The rebellious nonconformist does not see himself as mindlessly conforming to his subculture, and neither does his subculture. These are signals that are transpiring in the dark. They're unknown to the interactants, right? And yet we could say from an outside perspective that the signaling is still taking place, right? So this is a social paradox. And what a charismatic person is a person who is good at playing these social games, a person who is good at covering up their signals, who is good at virtue signaling without making it look like they're virtue signaling, who is good at seeming authentic without making it seem like they were trying to be authentic, who makes you think that they don't care what you think, who is humble and as a result looks morally superior to less humble people. The charismatic person is an expert in these kinds of social paradoxes. which means that the magnetism they have over us is kind of mysterious, because we don't know how they achieved it. Because they've concealed their signals, we feel drawn to them, but we don't know why we're drawn to them, because they've done such a good job of concealing all of the tactics that they've played to get us to be drawn to them. And so I think that is explains the underlying mechanics of charisma and why we see it as so ineffable and indescribable.
Yeah, so it's more about signaling part, yes, like how I see the other person. I mean, someone else might be competent or less competent, and they can be charismatic at the same time, but it all depends on how well you play that game, that charisma game.
Right. Yeah. It depends on whether you see the person as try hard, as caring what you think, as trying to look competent, as opposed to just being purely competent in and of themselves, right? As showing off versus being authentic or real. What's interesting about charisma is we view them we view charismatic people as sort of the pinnacle of authenticity and realness, but in some sense they're the opposite. They have carefully manicured their affectations and their utterances and their social signals to mimic the ideal social partner that is ideally lovely and attractive and magnetic. And because they are so good at that, and they're so good at covering that up, we don't see it, and we assume that it's not there. So yeah, I would be interested to know if there's a correlation between charisma and moral character. I'm not sure what the answer is. It's an empirical question, but I'm dimly aware of the fact that many sociopaths are often charismatic. It would be interesting to look into this. But yeah, I think charisma can be dangerous. It's a kind of social magical power that people wield. A charismatic person can manipulate you without being manipulative, right? That is their power. They can make you think that, they don't care what you think, even though they really do care what you think at the end of the day. They can get defensive, or they can defend themselves and defend their reputations and their character without looking defensive, right? That is another part of their superpower. So they're basically carrying around a bag that says tools for becoming a cult leader. So it's no surprising that charismatic people become cult leaders. They have immense power over other people, and people use power to their advantage.
Right. So yeah, I mean, you can imagine one person competent and really fit for the job, or let's say leader for country or whatever, but they lack the skill for being charismatic, and they get cast out. But then someone else comes in who has this characteristic of cult, like the building a cult following, and they take over and everyone follows. So it's like, I guess it's more about, can we say anything about like evolutionary origins of this? I mean, if I'm, let's say, hunter-gatherer living, and if I know that this person with these characteristics, if I have a belief that they will be able to get the most amount of food for our tribe and whatever, so I don't really care about their competence or whatever, as long as they show that skill, and I have that belief. I don't really have to think about their actual skills and competence.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and I thought a lot about it. I think the mistake we make is in thinking that the main things we're after are tangible resources like food or territory or tools. I think the biggest resource to us is social. A social relationship, a cooperative relationship. These are our tickets to real resources for a lifetime. We might go hungry one day, but if we have no friends, we're dead, right? So when a charismatic person successfully manipulates someone without looking manipulative, for example, you might think that the person being manipulated is actually made worse off. But when you think about the social context of that manipulation and the political structures that exist within any social group, the person being manipulated is in many cases better off for having been manipulated. Because if the charismatic person is an effective manipulator, then they're going to manipulate lots of other people too. They're going to gain a loyal following and have many loyal allies prepared to take their side and have their back. And so if I'm the one person in the tribe who sees through the manipulation and calls bullshit on it, and everyone else has fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, and they're all loyal to this charismatic person, well, my genes are fucked, right? So in that sense, seeing reality, seeing the truth, has been bad for me. It has alienated me from everyone in the group. And so what I think what's interesting about charisma is that when they manipulate people or deceive people or conceal their signals, it's a kind of symbiotic deception in which the deceiver and the deceived are both benefiting. And I think that explains why we are drawn to charismatic people, why we let them. You might expect natural selection to build up resistances to these kinds of charismatic people, but in fact, those resistances would be bad. They might have even been selected against. We might have been selected to fall for the charismatic performer, insofar as we can expect other people to fall for that performance as well.
Yeah, I did not see that coming. That's an interesting insight, that the person being deceived is also benefiting. Interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. How does that happen? How does that process happen?
Well, if the deceived can count on other people being deceived as well, and if there are benefits to coordinating with others, to being deceived alongside other people, or to sharing the same beliefs as other people, then you want to be deceived. Because insofar as you're the only one who's not deceived, then you are not coordinating with other people. You are disagreeing with them, right? And insofar as we live in a very political species where people form alliances and have each other's backs, if I'm the only one who disagrees with the group about the value of a particular person, if I'm the only one who sees Kim Jong-un as being full of shit, right, I'm fucked. If I come out and say, hey, Kim Jong-un actually isn't as charismatic and brilliant and talented as we're all saying he is. He's full of shit. He's an asshole. He's a tyrant. Well, guess what's going to happen to me? I'm dead, right? So, I mean, that's a very clear example of the case in which deception can be beneficial to the deceived. Because insofar as you see through the deception and you are vocal about it, you're dead. So I think it is a weird and interesting case where gullibility can be an advantage. And, it's an underexplored idea in evolutionary psychology. And I'm hoping to develop it further and write more about it. But as far as I'm aware, no one has had this insight before. And I think, it deserves more attention. It deserves mathematical modeling in terms of the game theory of it. It's something I'm planning on looking into. But yeah, it seems like once you start to understand this deception as sometimes being symbiotic or beneficial to the deceived, I think a lot of the weirdness and the strangeness of human culture begins to be illuminated.
Yeah, let's just all follow our tribe leader and tolerate all the bullshit that he or she might be uttering. But at the end, we are going to benefit from it. I mean, he or she is going to share all the food from the hunt with all the rest of us if we keep them happy, as long as we don't open those, question them and so on. Yep, interesting. So are there any strategies or tools that or principles that we can use to avoid being manipulated, assuming that it's not for our benefit?
It's a good question. One strategy is to read this really insightful substack called Everything Is Bullshit that dissects all the instances of bullshitting that go on in human culture. That I think will give you a really good roadmap to understanding this stuff and preventing yourself from being manipulated. I'm only half joking there. I do think I've written some things that are good at calling out particular popular examples of bullshit. Some helpful sources. I have a post called Deep Bullshit that dissects what a deepity is and how pseudo-profound ideas can seem profound even though they're stupid. I have another post called Bullshit Advice, which dissects when and why and how advice can be bullshit, particularly in the self-help industry. Other than that, I think just cultivating a sense of critical thinking and availing yourself of the wealth of scientific information that is available to you. I mean, what people don't realize is that you could just email a scientist and they'll answer your email 9 times out of 10. You could say like, oh, I'm really curious about this idea you had or this paper you published, or I have this question. Like most of the time they'll be like, whoa, someone in the real world is actually interested in what I do, and they will absolutely respond to you and be very kind to you. So really,
but it's similar to how I reached out to you. Yep, when you responded and said, yeah, let's have this conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Whoa, someone is interested in the bullshit I'm writing? Oh man, I got to talk to this person.
Yeah, I mean, as ever since that conversation that I had with that person when they asked me, how are you? And then I said, no, all these things. And they say, shut the fuck up. I wanted to have this conversation. And so what's going on there?
Yeah. I mean, so like truth and rigorous, vetted information is pretty easy to find. You just have to, ask the right people. Yeah, there's some bullshit in social science as well. Obviously, there's a replication crisis, and there's plenty of bad stuff in there as well. But if you learn how to critically evaluate research, if you know what numbers to look at, um, if you learn to only trust findings when they've been replicated many times, and when there's a whole vast literature on them, then I think you're going to be pretty good. Like if you just trust like the most well replicated, well established stuff that's like at the center of any field of knowledge, you're going to be, pretty good at knowing what's right and seeing through manipulation. You just look like the most basic findings of the social sciences, like motivated reasoning. When we want to believe something for social purposes, we're going to find reasons to believe it, right? And we're going to dismiss reasons to not believe it. That's really well established. It's been replicated just thousands of times. You can also just see it with your own eyes. Like if you're living as a person in the world, motivated reasoning is everywhere. Just knowing that exists and that people will be motivated to believe things that they have, a self-interested reason for believing, that gets you so far in terms of anticipating bullshit. Just knowing what people's agendas are, and honestly, just knowing their true agendas, their true motives. I think one of the easiest ways to get mired in bullshit is to believe our bullshit about our motives, to think that we're pursuing happiness or authenticity or self-actualization or any of these high-minded abstractions. I think when you buy that stuff, it's much easier to get manipulated than when you see through to the deeper layers, that we're social creatures, we're hierarchical creatures, we're political creatures. We are often, first and foremost, seeking status, respect, power, esteem, attention, control, safety, security, loyalty. When you look at the real goals that real human beings have, and you are wary of when a piece of information is convenient for one of those goals, that gets you 90% of the way to just being, immune to bullshit. I don't think you'll ever get to 100. Bullshitting is everywhere, and sometimes the bullshitter is going to win. It's just inevitable. But you can try to guard yourself against it in the best way you can.
It's also very easy to become cynical. Yep. Because, imagine if you're a young person just entering, let's say, academia as a young scholar or whatever, and you see all these status games being played and you realize, oh my God, I thought it's all about intellectual curiosity, but all these people are acting like they're high school students and they're like betrayals and gossips and everything. So it's very easy that you can become cynical and say, this is the human nature, and get away with all these intellectual curiosity. I don't care. So I think it's also important that you don't become too cynical, because even, you may see a lot of bullshit, but like no one is stopping you from becoming genuine in what you do. So
yeah, that's true. So yeah, I would say that being cynical is not a bad thing. I think, in fact, being cynical is underrated. I think we could use more cynicism in our culture, not less. But when I mean cynicism, I mean genuine, consistent cynicism that applies to yourself just as much as everyone else. I think oftentimes the cynics that we see in the world are one-sided cynics. They're inconsistent cynics. They're cynical about everyone but themselves, or they're cynical about their political opponents but not their political allies. That is not the kind of cynicism I'm arguing for. I'm arguing for a consistent, genuine cynicism that includes oneself in a kind of humbling way, that views us all as flawed creatures that are ultimately in it for ourselves and our families. That is the kind of cynicism that I think we could use more of, a cynicism that is informed by evolutionary psychology and the best knowledge we have about our species. We could use more of that. Then again, you can take it too far. As you said, you can be too cynical. It is certainly possible to be too cynical, and say that everything is bullshit. But where to draw the line is tough. I would say that it's good to be cynical about humanity in general, and it's good to be cynical about institutions to make sure that the incentives are good. When you're thinking about incentive structures, it's good to be cynical because you want the incentives to actually track our real, self-interested motivations. But when you're thinking about individual people, I think that is when cynicism is less valuable, because there's a tremendous amount of variation among humans. Some humans really do suck. Some humans are real psychopaths. And some humans are really wonderful. There's some real saints out there. And I think being cynical about humanity can sometimes blind you to the immense variation within humanity. And so I think we ought to be cynical in the abstract when thinking about institutions. But when it comes to individual people, I think we ought to throw out that cynicism and look at the merits and the actions of that particular individual. And oftentimes we will be pleasantly surprised by how kind and genuine a particular individual might be.
The original meaning of cynicism is quite different from what we mean by today by cynicism. It used to be 4th century BC Greek philosophy advocating for a life in accordance with nature, rejecting social conventions, wealth, and status. So, interestingly, it's about against anything that we discussed today. So, I mean, we have this character Diogenes. I don't know if you are familiar with. He used to be the most famous cynic. So, I mean, it's quite different from what we mean today by cynicism, the actual meaning of the word.
Yeah, it's interesting how it evolved. That's I don't know why that would be the case. I mean, it might be that it arose from kind of anti-status game where people saying they're above it all. I don't conform. I don't care about status. And so you could be cynical in the modern sense about cynicism in the historical sense. It's interesting.
There is this famous story where Alexander the Great comes to Diogenes and says, I am the Alexander. What do you wish for me to bring to the life? And then he says, just stay out of my sun. You're blocking my sunlight. And then Alexander says, if I wasn't Alexander, I would certainly choose to be Diogenes here. So that's the idea of cynicism, where you don't care about anything, basically. You just live in the barrel, live in the street, piss in the street, you live your life. If you're hungry, you just collect the food from the street, and that's it. Very natural lifestyle.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there is a sense in which cynicism can be strategic, where the goal of your cynicism is to make some status game collapse, is to expose the hollowness of it, of the values that are being pursued, and to accuse everyone else of being a petty, egotistical status seeker. And that can often be in the cynic's interest if they themselves are losing in that status game. If they're at the bottom of that social hierarchy, if they're one of the losers in that status game, it is in their interest to try to make it collapse. And so I think that might explain some of the connection or the correlation we might see between people who are low status or alienated or losers and their appetite for cynicism or nihilism or skepticism of people's sacred values. And so that's another, I think, dangerous side of cynicism, where you can where you're not arriving at it through a genuine search for truth or search for insight or consilience about human nature or about institutions. You're arriving at it for self-interested reasons, because you're losing a particular status game and you're going to just tear everyone else down to lift yourself up. Chaos as a ladder is a quote from Game of Thrones. There's some interesting research by Michael Bank Peterson showing that people who are high in so-called need for chaos, or people who agree with statements like "I want to watch the world burn," that these are the people who spread political misinformation most frequently, and they don't really care whether it's on the left or on the right. They just want to sow chaos. They'll spread dangerous bullshit regardless, just to kind of tear society down. Really interesting stuff. And that speaks to this idea that, if you're a loser, if you're alienated, you're going to have an appetite for cynical, nihilistic ideas, not because they're necessarily correct or insightful, but because they're in your self-interest. So that is something to watch out for as well. But that just might be my own self-interested strategy as someone who's winning a status game and who doesn't want it to be torn down by losers. So, it's all, you can take cynicism and apply it to anyone, including yourself. And, sometimes it can be depressing, but sometimes it can be illuminating and insightful and humbling. And on balance, I think we could use more of it.
Also, the human nature has this tendency to rationalize everything. Yeah. So if I don't get what I want from life, wealth, status, I can just say, you know what, they're not important in life. So
Yep.
it's stupid to even pursue them. So look at all these stupid. They're gonna die at one time in their life. So why even pursue it? It's not even permanent.
Now you're speaking like a true David Pinsof. I like it.
Yeah, it takes 1 hour to get manipulated. Yeah, yeah. I have one final question. So about the Cards Against Humanity. I mean, I got introduced to this game 4 years ago in some party where I really enjoyed playing it. So you co-created one of the best-selling party games in history, which is this Cards Against Humanity, and also got a PhD in evolutionary psychology. Which one taught you more about the human nature?
It's a beautiful question. I'm afraid I don't have a beautiful answer. It was the PhD in evolutionary psychology. No, I've certainly learned a lot by working on Cards Against Humanity. I've learned a lot about comedy, about business and branding and the creative process. But in terms of insights about human nature, it's no comparison to the amount I've learned through studying evolutionary psychology and related disciplines like animal behavior and game theory. You know, you can learn a lot by doing and by living in the world, but there's also no substitute for just intensive study in terms of the knowledge that has been accumulated throughout history. So, yeah, it was the PhD.
Maybe one question. I mean, you have this famous Substack, Everything is Bullshit. I would recommend people to go and check out if they're interested. So, is there anything else that you're working on these days? Any article, research, book related to these topics that we talked about that you're excited about to examine?
Yeah, I just wrote an academic preprint about the evolutionary psychology of humor, which is sort of a nice alignment of the two sides of myself. I try to dissect what humor is and how it evolved and how it informs our various social strategies. Dark humor, absurdism, mockery, all political satire, all the different dimensions of humor, why we find humor attractive in a social partner, inside jokes. I think it's a wealth of interesting stuff, interesting psychological stuff, and I try to understand it from a Darwinian perspective because I feel like Darwinian theories of humor haven't been satisfying to me intellectually. I feel like it's still one of the great Darwinian mysteries of why we're apes that emit these strange panting sounds.
Yeah, I
we're doing
mean
right now.
that's quite interesting. I mean, I was thinking about this recently. Like, what's the purpose of laughing? I mean, I don't see any other animal doing this besides humans, like making jokes and laughing about it, and then out of stupid stuff. So what's the evolutionary purpose behind it?
Well, I'll give you the snapshot of my paper, but at the end of the day, you should read my preprint. It's called All Mixed Up, a solution to the evolutionary mystery of humor. So it's funny you say that laughter doesn't happen on other animals. It actually does. Jokes, probably not, or at least we don't know because animals don't talk to us, but laughter at least seems to exist in other animals, particularly in great apes. Chimpanzees emit a kind of rhythmic panting sound that is eerily reminiscent of human laughter. And well, when and why do they emit this panting sound? Well, they emit it during bouts of rough and tumble play, when they're like play chasing each other, play fighting each other, play tickling. That's when they emit this sound. And scientists believe that the purpose of this vocal signal is to signal that the interaction is a play interaction and not a real interaction. That this may seem like we're trying to kill each other, we're fighting, or we're chasing, or whatever. I'm trying to hurt you, but I'm laughing to signal that that I'm not actually trying to hurt you. This is not real aggression. It's play aggression. We're just playing. We shouldn't take this seriously. You shouldn't hold a grudge against me. I'm not trying to kill you. We shouldn't be afraid or mad or anything like that. Right? It sort of diffuses the tension from the situation so that we can practice these important skills like, how to win in a fight in a safe way. Right. But in order to practice these skills, we need to know that the other one knows that the other one knows that we shouldn't be taking this seriously as real aggression.
The origin of wrestling, boxing, and any other thing. Yeah, when we practice these, it's
yeah, absolutely. You can think of play behavior more broadly as just a kind of practice for important skills that you'll need to rely on as an adult. And our play behavior serves, I think, the same function. But we need some kind of signal to when our play gets a little bit on the border of, oh, is this real? Is he really trying to hurt me? Is this really dangerous? Like, when we get to places like that, we need to send a signal that no, this is not serious. I'm not trying to hurt you. Don't get mad. Don't be afraid. Right. And so I think that is the evolutionary origin of laughter. But then it raises the question: well, why do we need this signal when we tell a joke? Well, what's going on there? What is a joke, or what is a humorous situation? So I think a humorous situation can be understood mathematically as a mix-up in a coordination game. So I actually try to mathematically model this in my paper. I look at the game theory of coordination. And the simplest possible coordination game is we each have two options. We can move left or move right. And we're trying to pass each other in a narrow hallway. And if I go left and you go right, then we successfully pass each other and we win 1 point. Hooray. But if we both go left or both go right, then we bump into each other and we lose a point. Boo. Right? That's the game. It's a really simple game. And you can analyze its properties. But what happens when we bump into each other, right? When we fail to coordinate and fail to successfully pass each other? That is what I'm formally defining as a mix-up. And you could also think of similar mix-ups in terms of communicating. We all we have to agree on which sounds correspond to which things in the world. And if we both agree on that, then we successfully communicate and we win 1 point. And if we disagree on that, where if I use a sound to mean one thing and you think I meant a different thing, well, then we have failed to coordinate, we have miscommunicated, there's been a confusion, and we lose a point, right? It's the exact same payoff structure. So communicating, coordinating, passing each other in a hallway, showing up at the same time and place to a meeting. If my dentist says your meeting, you should show up at 9, and I show up at 9 p.m., that's another kind of mix-up that would be costly for both of us. And you could think of humans as a species surviving on these coordination games. Like our survival literally depends on us communicating successfully, coordinating successfully, showing up at the same time and place on a hunt, for example, using the same sounds to mean the same things, even just using tools according to their appropriate functions, using the right hygienic practices or performing the ritual in the right way. These are all coordination games, and we face severe costs for misunderstanding them, for mixing things up, for using the wrong tool or in the wrong way, or using the wrong word, or thinking that you meant one thing when you actually meant a different thing. These are all mix-ups in the technical sense and the mathematical sense. And I think we, number one, evolved a sense of mix-ups, the ability to detect when a mix-up has taken place so that we can avoid them and avoid those costs. You can think of that as the sense of humor, the sense that something is awry, someone is confused about something, right? That you can think of that as the sense of humor. And laughter is to signal that a mix-up has taken place, number one, and number two, to diffuse the costs of that mix-up. So let's say we mix up the meanings of the phrase hook up with. So most people use the term hook up with to mean have sex with. Occasionally, you could sort of mean it to say meet up with. I hooked up with some friends at the mall or whatever.
Yeah, it happens a lot.
If we mix up those two meanings, and you say that you hooked up with my mother last night, that's a very costly mix-up, right? If I interpret that as real communication, that could destroy a relationship. It could destroy a relationship with my mother. Like it could, all sorts of costs, right? So we need some way to diffuse those costs, to create common knowledge of the fact that I'm not taking this communication seriously. You're not taking this communication seriously. I know that you know that I know that we're not taking this seriously. And that's what laughter is. It's a signal that creates common knowledge that there has been a mix-up or a miscommunication or a faux pas or a misunderstanding of some kind. And I know that there has been a mix-up. You know there's been a mix-up. And we're not taking it seriously. We're not treating the mix-up as real, right? In the same way that the play signal is a kind of mix-up signal that says to the other party, we're not treating this as actual aggression. When we have a miscommunication and we laugh, what that is signaling is we're not treating this as actual communication. This is just play communication. And that helps to diffuse the costs of the miscommunication. And that's what the function of laughter is. And so I get into all the details in the paper, but that is the gist of the theory.
Yeah, it's a form of bullshit, but maybe more enjoyable form of bullshit where you can have fun and, laugh.
Yeah. Yeah. Shooting the shit, is often referred to as joking and laughing. So yeah, There's definitely
Can
parallels.
Can you imagine a future where all the social games are eliminated? Let's think about the most extreme scenario where we have some kind of machine where I can always understand what you're thinking, and you have nowhere to hide. You cannot basically hide anything from me. And can you imagine such scenario in the future happening with our obsession these days to measure everything and quantify everything? Can we imagine such scenario in the future?
Where all of our social games are out in the open, and
Yep. Yeah.
I think that would be hell. I think that would be the seventh circle of hell. I think there's a reason why we cover up these things. It helps smooth over faux pas. It helps preserve our relationships. It helps, damaging information. It prevents damaging information from escalating. So, just the simplest example, like if I mildly dislike someone, I could still have a relationship with them and, maybe work with them and gain benefits from a relationship with them. But if they know that I mildly dislike them, well, then all of a sudden they have a reason to mildly dislike me. And then if I know that they mildly dislike me, then I might dislike them even more. And if I dislike them even more, then they might dislike me even more. And all of a sudden, what has gone from a perfectly cost-free dislike has now destroyed our relationship, right? And I think there are lots of things like that in the social world, where if truth emerged, it would destroy our relationships. I think this is the origin of politeness, of etiquette, right? We don't say when someone is ugly or fat, right? We don't say when someone is low value to us, right? We want to hide those annoyances. We want to hide our dislikes. So yeah, I think if all of our social
But
games were
maybe
out in the open, yeah.
But maybe that the problem is that we are just everyone, society, every single individual is very easily offended. I mean, call me a fat, and I will take that information and just go to the gym and become better. Call me ugly, and I will. Uh, so it's like, how much can you tolerate truth? And maybe we cannot tolerate truth, and that's why we have to play all these social games. And yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I am sympathetic with that view. Obviously, I write a blog that tries to expose this bullshit. I think that project can be taken too far and too personally, but it is good to pursue that project in the abstract, to think about humanity in general, particularly when we're talking about politics and institutions. Like, we need to have a realistic understanding of how humans work, right? When we're engaging in the intellectual life, broadly construed, I think that kind of cynicism is good, and we need more of it. But when we're engaging in our personal lives, like, I don't know, it can be corrosive. There's this movement, of never lying or always telling the truth. I forget what the radical honesty, I think, is what it's called. Scott Alexander has a wonderful post about this, where he basically just says that this is going to ruin your life if you pursue this strategy, and I think he's right. I think there are self-interested reasons why we hide and conceal the truth. And if we stop doing that, we will pay the price for that. Humans aren't stupid. They don't needlessly, they don't just harm themselves for no reason. Usually when they're covering things up, they have a reason for it. And it's ultimately going to track their social interests. So yeah, I would certainly try to see through more bullshit when pursuing the intellectual life. But when it comes to one's personal life, I might set that goal aside.
have you seen any personality differences or traits where someone is more likely to tolerate bullshit or social games, or versus less likely to tolerate? And so have you found some interesting data or empirical evidence there?
No, not that I'm aware of. As far as I'm aware, there's not a lot of research on bullshit and bullshitting and seeing through bullshit, and the psychology of it. It's kind of a new field. Field is even too strong. There's maybe one guy, one or two people studying this empirically. So yeah, there's so much we don't know. I suspect it's intuitively true. Some people seem more susceptible to bullshit than other people. Some people seem more, hard-headed than others. In terms of, intuitively, anecdotally, that seems right. But there's just not a lot of hard data on it at the moment. And I'd love to see more of it. I think part of the problem is that psychologists are often in thrall to this bullshit. because they rely on self-report data on the things that people say, and people say a lot of bullshit. I think one problem that psychologists face is taking our bullshit too seriously, taking it at face value, assuming that the stories we tell about our political behavior are correct, that we really are pursuing equality and justice and patriotism, all these high-minded things. And psychologists take it at face value, and they go too far with it, and they assume that politics is this high-minded, altruistic thing when it's really a more cynical affair. I think the same is true of happiness and the pursuit of self-expression, self-esteem, authenticity, all these psychological buzzwords, I think, make the mistake of taking our bullshit at face value and saying, oh, people are saying that they're pursuing happiness and self-esteem and self-actualization and authenticity, so let's take that seriously and let's measure, in what situations are they likely to say that they're happy or authentic or whatever, and then let's, give them a bunch of surveys, see what correlates with what, and let's see what correlates with the bullshit, right? And they never once actually question the bullshit and ask themselves if it actually makes sense at a mechanistic level or at a Darwinian level for people to be motivated by these abstractions. They just kind of take it at face value and they study it. And so I think part of the problem is psychologists and social scientists themselves are so steeped in the bullshit that they cannot see the water they swim in. And so that is probably another reason why we haven't developed a full-fledged science of bullshit, because we're just so steeped in it, we cannot step out of it.
That's why we need to. Yeah, that's why we need to invent that mind reading machine that I was talking about and give it first to the psychologists and social scientists. Yeah, all for the purpose of science and intellectual curiosity. Nothing spooky there. That's all for the sake of science.
Love that. Yeah.
David, thank you so much. It's been great fun talking to you today. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.